Since its release way back in 2014, Bloodborne has firmly cemented itself as one of my favourite video games of all time. That's not something that I say lightly, that's just how good I genuinely think the game is. It was my first ever platinum trophy, a feat that did take me a long time to achieve. Whilst I technically played Dark Souls 2 before Bloodborne, I didn't get on with it at first and I gave up for a while. Bloodborne was the first Souls-like game that I actually played through to completion, and it kind of kickstarted an obsession for me. The mix of gothic horror reminiscent of Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, followed by the hard turn into Lovecraftian horror in the second half, was a match made in heaven for me. Add to this that brutal, fast-paced combat and rewarding exploration, and I was completely, utterly, and totally hooked for life. Since then, I've platinumed every single Soulsborne game that I've gotten my hands on, and to say that I'm excited for Elden Ring would be somewhat of an understatement. Now, I remember the first time that I booted up Bloodborne, feeling like it reminded me of Nightmare Creatures, a PlayStation 1 game that I thoroughly adored and had to hide from my disapproving mother. She had seen me play the demo that came on one of PlayStation Magazine's cover discs, and didn't like the violence and gore, naturally. I must have been 8 or 10 at the time, but, like Resident Evil 2, I ended up borrowing the game and I just played it when I knew my mother was otherwise occupied, cooking or whatever. Naturally, I never got overly far, but I still adored it. Well, apparently I wasn't the only one to feel that Bloodborne was reminiscent of Nightmare Creatures, and well, that brings us to today's video. Ahoy there, I'm Captain Benzie, and today we're going to be talking about Bloodborne PSX, a fan-made retro demake of Bloodborne for PC. Bloodborne PSX asks the question, what if Bloodborne, but PlayStation 1? And then runs wild with the concept. This is a project I've been eagerly watching for a long time, both excited to finally get to play it, whilst also anxious that the developer was going to be sent a cease and desist letter from FromSoft or Sony or whoever. Fortunately, it appears that that letter never came, and the game launched yesterday. You can download it for free using the link that I've popped in the description below. Now, at first, the project appeared to just be taking Bloodborne and dropping it down to 32-bit graphics with all the janky angular 3D and the wobbly textures that you'd associate with the PlayStation console's hardware, and at a quick glance, you'd be forgiven for thinking that that's all it is. Many of the most iconic parts of Bloodborne's opening segment are represented here with clearly identifiable sections, sometimes as almost one-to-one. Surprisingly, but in a positively awesome way, the game is so much more than that. To say that I know Bloodborne inside out would kind of be selling myself short. I can tell you where every darn item is in the game, the best routes to farm shards or souls at different levels, pretty much anything that you want to know. It's one of the benefits of my geeky autistic obsessions. Things immediately threw me off when the game sends you upstairs in Yosefka's clinic, which is the opening section of the original game. That's entirely new content to the PSX demake. It's not part of the PlayStation 4 version. Then you quickly realise that the developers have even considered how to map the controllers. You see, the PlayStation 1 may have had the first DualShock analog controller, but most games on the console were designed to assume that the player was still using the basic controller, without the sticks, without the rumble functions, etc. As such, L2 and R2 are good old camera swivel controls. Movement is consigned solely to the D-pad, and equipping and changing weapons has to be done entirely through menus, and they're ring menus, like the original Tomb Raider games, which I thought was really cool. They've even had to move healing, which had its own dedicated button in the PS4 original, to count instead as a quick item, meaning that you sometimes have to manically cycle back to your blood vials in the middle of combat, and that's cost me a few lives if I'm being completely frank. Then you hit Central Yharnam, which is the first part of the main game back on PS4, and things all feel very familiar again. The layout follows the blueprints of the original game pretty closely, until it doesn't again. Whole new side streets have been opened up with new shortcuts, even new lanterns to use. For those of you who don't know the original game, lanterns are your checkpoints. Dying will send you back to the last one that you used, dropping all of your blood echoes where you died. Blood echoes are what you get when you kill enemies, like experience points. And you have the chance to recover these. They're what you use for leveling up and buying items, etc. Now, obviously, Bloodborne PSX has been designed for modern Windows systems that are capable of running much more intensive software than something designed for the original PlayStation 1, but the game is still cleverly carved up with loading screens that separate the large world of the original into the bite-sized chunks that would be necessary to run on the original PlayStation hardware. In fact, in the graphics menu, you still have all kinds of crazy settings, from the usual scan lines to frames per second limiting, even simulated FPS drops, because the original hardware would have had this in intense situations. Now, this can be toggled if you don't want to be too hardcore in your emulation, which I completely understand. Combat is surprisingly crisp too, if a little janky in places. The lock-on function is mapped to the X button, or the bottom one if you're using a non-PlayStation controller, which also serves as the button that resets the camera behind you, and it's the button you press when you want to interact with things. Now, this is a sacrifice made to ensure that the game is fully playable on an original PlayStation controller, but the controls, yeah, they're definitely awkward, and I can see this putting some folks right off. Again, this is part of that authentic experience that they're aiming for, but I would have liked button mapping options for those who want to experience the game without being limited by that authenticity, like the graphics settings have. It's also really nice to hear that the original game's amazing soundtrack, seriously, this is one of those soundtracks that I have on my phone and I genuinely listen to whilst driving or just relaxing or doing all kinds of stuff. It's been redone in PS1 era MIDI files. It's charming and it really sells the whole package, although many of the game's original voice acting has been reused for NPCs. Honestly, this felt a little bit too clean, and I wish they'd kind of compressed these down a bit further to really fit that feel. You've got this MIDI soundtrack, the PlayStation 1 era 32-bit graphics, and then crystal clear voice acting. What I also found really cool is how those completely new areas have been added, and there are tons of them. Beyond the side streets I mentioned previously, Bloodborne PSX features massively expanded sewer sections, and the Dark House from the original, if you know, you know, has been expanded outwards to an entire derelict manor to explore. This adds so much variety to the game, and it ensures that folks like me who've played the original to death are still constantly surprised, delighted, and engaged by having entirely new content to explore. The expanded sewers may contain a poison swamp style area, something that Bloodborne has several of already and can make for infuriating gameplay, but these were easy to handle and not as bad as other poison swamps in the original game, or indeed throughout the entire Soulsborne series. The basement below the manor was awesome too, adding entirely new lore implications and some really atmospheric areas. The boss fights are also really solid. They do emulate the original game's fights really well, but with the retro aesthetics and controls. Now, this is really cool to look at, but the controls do leave some aspects of the fights feeling a little bit unfair, which isn't really an experience that I'm used to in Souls games. Combat normally feels harsh, but fair, and dying is usually clearly your own fault. So having died in the remake to things like the janky lock-on or weird hitboxes was a little bit frustrating, though again, I guess this is part of that authentic PlayStation hardware experience all over again. And really, that's the crux of the matter here. If you grew up with this era of game, then the janky controls feel almost natural, I guess. The MIDI music is charming, the wobbly graphics are strangely homely. The game feels like that era of PlayStation horror games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil 2, and that's absolutely awesome. For those who didn't grow up with that though, I get that this can be confusing. Bloodborne exists, why would you play a version that looks this bad and has these awkward controls and confusing game design? Why are you sitting through forced loading screens that literally do not need to be there? This is Carrie's ethos. She's a huge fan of the original Bloodborne. She's platinumed it like me and regularly runs through it again. But to her, this PSX version is just a confusing downgrade, and that's okay too. I have to agree that I can't explain to her why I enjoy this game so damn much. For all intents and purposes, it is a downgrade in every single respect compared to the original, but strangely, that's the point? It's confusing. It's strange to say that I'm really enjoying playing a remake of a game that looks, sounds, and controls worse than the original, but here we are. It's a fun little experiment that takes something that I adore and drapes it with the trappings of nostalgia, and it does that with style. Ultimately, if you're a fan of this kind of thing, then you'll love Bloodborne PSX, and if you're not, you're probably wondering why I'm wasting my time waxing lyrical about it. Either way though, it is free to download. It runs on potato hardware, as evidenced by the fact that my cranky laptop just runs it without question, and so it's just worth giving a try, even if you haven't played Bloodborne. And if you haven't, and you have access to a PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, or a PC capable of running PlayStation Now, then you really owe it to yourself to experience it. It genuinely is one of the best games ever made. For now though, I'm imagining that it's 1998 again, that I'm 9 years old, and I'm listening out for my mother's footsteps up the stairs. If you enjoyed this video, it really helps if you'd hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell. I know you're all sick of hearing it by now, but it does make such a difference for us content creators. And if you want to be extra awesome, then head over to Patreon, where you can help support this channel even more and keep me doing what it is that I do. Thank you all so much for your support. Happy sailing, and see you all next time.